I'm Peter Maravellis. Welcome to you all here in the Poetry Room, and welcome to all of you online. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. I want to take a moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Of course, they did a much better job than we have, so do some research, find out who your Indigenous folks are, wherever you are. Such a great pleasure to be hosting an event with the Poetry Center at San Francisco State, and to have Major Jackson and Tonya Foster with us tonight. A thrill. It's a little bittersweet tonight because this is probably the last time I'm going to be working with Steve Dickinson, at least to this capacity. Steve is the director of the San Francisco Poetry Center and also the American Poetry Archives. He's been doing amazing work in kind of putting together like over 4,000 hours of materials, videos, audio, you name it. And also he's one of the great community builders here in the Bay Area. So such a pleasure to have you with us and to have worked with you all these years. An honor, sir, to have you here with us.
Thank you, Peter. That's how I was going to begin, by saying that Peter and I have done a good number of things together over the years. As I was walking down Columbus tonight, headed for dinner, I thought about the John Giorno evening and how fantastic John Giorno was, but how shitty the microphone was. And it just, and all of his work involves the mic and repetition. And, so it didn't kill the night, but it just, that was it. But it was a beautiful thing to be able to do and to host people like that. And we've done a number of things here in the space and at different venues in the town and collaborated in multiple ways many times. I've been at the Poetry Center 25 years, so this goes back. And Peter's been here that long, haven't you? Almost? Oh, my goodness. My goodness. So that's sacred. Yeah. And it's a total delight tonight. I didn't compile 4,000 hours of anything, but there is something like that in our archive at San Francisco State that goes back to 1954. This is 70 years of that archive. We're not quite, but almost as old as City Lights books. Same era, some of the same makers and the same milieu. And so we've always felt a strong kinship between SF State's Poetry Center, City Lights books, booksellers and publishing, and the people here, So I've been great friends and supports. And when I was a bookseller, I learned a lot from, say, Paul Yamazaki, Yeah, as many people have. A super mentor to booksellers and book buyers and other, a total jazz nut, for instance, and a good drinker. But tonight we have my colleague and friend, Tonya M. Foster, who is, yes. We've been really happy to have Tonya in the Bay Area for a number of years. She was at California College of the Arts, and then since 2021, you've been at San Francisco State. And so keep your eyes on Tonya, because she will be doing some of the poetry related things as I retire, in the coming months. So, we'll collaborate in some ways, but I'm going to start to drift away. Like, I know I'm going to drift. So Tonya is a stunning poet and thinker, scholar. Her one book that you can find is A Swarm of Bees in High Court, a book of poetry. And she's at work on 2 or 3 other poetry projects, essays, etc., that are going to come to fruition before too long. So watch for those. And a teacher at San Francisco State in poetry and poetics in the master's program and the undergraduate writing program at SF State. And but especially a friend. It's been a really dear friendship that we've had. And it's been a treat for me and a great pleasure. And I am going to ask Tonya to introduce Major Jackson, who will read first, and then the two of them will engage in a conversation that will open up to the audience. Okay. Yeah. We got it?
So I'm supposed to be here introducing Major, but I have to say a few words about Steve, right? And of course, I'm going to start with a few words about me. Anybody who knows me knows I'm basically an introvert. And so Steve, throughout my time here, is the person who's like, okay, Tonya, you want to go to this? Come on, Tonya, go do this. Let's go see this, Tonya. And so won't let me hide out as the hermit. He's also the friend who has said, okay, you'll be great at SF State. And I've just been really appreciative. And I keep saying don't retire, but I'm tired. So I can't imagine, you know, yeah, I have you on speed dial. So Major, who I secretly call MJ, or not so secretly call MJ. I'll read the sort of standard bio, but he really is a friend who's dear to my heart. And there are a lot of reasons. One, I first met Major in New Orleans, where the older I get, the more Southern I become. And the more specifically Norleanian I become. And I met Major, and he just kind of had this open walk. And as he passed me, hey, I know you. And the only reason he knew me is because he was hanging out with people who had known me since I was in high school. And so it's that amazing kind of community, poetry community, that series of unexpected networks. I also love that he's one of the people who knows that in New Orleans, people ask who your people, where you're from. And that there's something about that being able to identify community and call up community. That's an incredible part of the work that Major does. So Major Jackson is the author of 6 books of poetry, including Razzle Dazzle, new and selected, right over there. The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canem Poetry Prize for first book of poems. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry 2019, Renga for Obama, and the Library of America's County Cullen collected poems. He's also the author of A Beat Beyond, the selected prose of Major Jackson, edited by Amor Coley, a recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets. We had interesting stories about Academy of American Poets people. Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, a Guggenheim, NEA, Radcliffe Institute, Harvard. Major has been awarded a pushcart, a Whiting, honored by the Pew Fellowship in the Arts by the Witter Biner Foundation in conjunction with the Library of Congress. He has published poems and essays in APR, The New Yorker, Orion, Paris Review, Ploughshares, and on. Major lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and Arts and Sciences, and serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. This is Major Jackson.
Good evening. First, let's just acknowledge the sacred space that we're in as well. My first trip, of course, to San Francisco involved a journey to this very room. I won't tell you how many years ago. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Tonya, for making this happen. This is the dream conversation that you and I have been having for a long time, made public. I have many dear folks in the room. Thank you all for being here. I was just saying to Tonya, God, if only I made enough money to have like a home in the Bay Area, I feel like my life would be complete. Then it's like, if only a lot of people had money who live here, you know.
And I talked about the artist co-op.
Yes, that's right. I'm gonna read a poem by request from Tonya. I'm happy she chose this poem because it allows me to talk about, speaking of artists, one particular artist who lived in my neighborhood in Germantown, Philadelphia, in a house that was nondescript, and I would learn later was full of musicians who not only played there during the day and all through the evening, but also they lived there, surprisingly. And this is the home of Sun Ra. Sun Ra inspired the title of the collection, Leaving Saturn. I did have a chance to meet Mr. Ra and members of his band when they played a art center in Philadelphia that I worked when I was an undergrad at Temple University. And then after graduating, I worked there for several more years, called the Painted Bride Art Center. And Sun Ra and his band would play New Year's Eve every year until he passed away. And I threw speakers, monitors on stage, and mic'd the band. I would read John Swed's biography of this wonderful artist who claimed to have been sent to Earth, claimed to have been sent to Earth to save it with his music. And to be a 20-something-year-old in the presence of someone who was creating a mythology of selfhood and creating a space about the possibilities of an art that could go beyond merely a practice. Underline merely. Leaving Saturn. Sun Ra and his year 2000 Myth Science Orchestra at Grindel's Lair Cabaret, 1986. Skyrocketed, my eyes dilate old copper pennies. Effortlessly, I play Manifesto of the One-Stringed Harp, only this time I'm washed ashore, shipwrecked in Birmingham. My black porcelain fingers, my sole possession, so I hammer out equations for a new thing. Agamatelli, Ovid, and Homer behind me. I toss apple peelings in the air and half-hair brushstrokes, the upkick of autumn leaves, the orchestra laying down for new dimensions. I could be at Berkeley teaching a course, Fixins, How to Dress Myth, or Generations, Spaceships in Harlem. Instead, vibes from Chi-Town. Must be Fletcher's big band music. Oh, my brother, the wind. I know this life is just a circus. I'm brushed aside, a naif, a charlatan, too avant-garde, satellite music for a futuristic tent, says one critic. Heartbreak in outer space, says another. Must be lunar dust on the brain. I head to New York. New York loves a spectacle. Wet pain of cement, sweet scent of gold swirling between skyscrapers so tall, looks like war. If what I'm told is true, Mars is dying. Nope. If what I'm told is true, Mars is dying. It's after the end of the world. So here I am in Philadelphia, Death's headquarters, here to save the cosmos, here to dance in a bed of living gravestones. I know why you chose that poem. Yeah.
I chose that poem and we talked about it for several days. Oh, the mic,
What up, peeps?
the relationship with the mic.
Yes.
I chose that poem for a lot of reasons. One, there's the beautiful preface to Leaving Saturn by Al Young that quotes that poem and talks about the kind of location of, I'll read an excerpt from it, but it quotes specifically those last stanzas. And Al writes, African-American musical and performing arts genius Sun Ra, composer of the song Space is the Place, also a great film, also unbelievably, he taught at Berkeley. But that's a whole other thing. It's after the end, and it's after the end of the world, claimed to have been from Saturn. Had been sent from Saturn by higher powers. Echoing Sun Ra, Major Jackson writes in Leaving Saturn, Mars is dying. It's after the end of the world. So here I am in Philadelphia, death's headquarters, here to save the cosmos, here to dance in a bed of living gravestones. And there's so many ways that we are at the end of the world, after the end of the world, living, dancing among gravestones. And so I thought of that, and there's a moment in this intro where Al Young writes, by the time, and he's sort of giving a history of poetry, right? What's happened in poetry. And at this point in the intro, he's talking about, he goes, by the time colonialism, that reckless handmaiden of industrialism, crossed the seas, extracting from the traffic of refined sugar, tobacco, rum, coffee, tea, and slaves, the kind of staggering profits that CIA and KGB-backed drug cartels and empires would later stash away in the 20th century. Everything was up for grabs. Nature long believed by traditional peoples to be inseparable from human beings was suddenly viewed merely as a base, a source of raw materials. Capital begot capitalism, which only seems to last as long as its sources of cheap labor and resources. In other words, to hold up the totem pole of ever-expanding profits, there has to be, and I'll say, the wretched at the bottom. And that I wanted to start with that poem and go there because I'm thinking about certainly the state of the world, which seems large and yet is not that large. And how do we write poetry? Not just how do we write poetry. I mean, we do what we do, no matter what terror is going on. But why bother to write poetry in the state of things as they are? Yeah.
First of all, when I read Al Young's introduction, I saw it when the book came out. They didn't send it in advance. It took me about a decade to really understand the heft of what he was saying and contextualizing my work as part of a reaction, or at least Sun Ra's work, and thus poetry. He does give a great kind of a contextualization of the romantics at the time in which industrialism was hitting, and what did it mean? What did it mean for poetry to assert a humanity of which an imagination was the great evidence of that. Some might argue, or if he were here today, he left us about a decade ago, I think a decade and a half ago, that project in a way has failed. I often see poetry as a grasp towards evidence that we are still alive, that our humanity is intact. Of course, we're alive, but our humanity is intact.
Well, it's funny. I also wonder if there's poetry that's happening that actually is about asserting a becoming, right? And a humanity that is beyond the failed humanity, right? And the definitions of humanity that have been a kind of part of a project
Yeah.
of enlightenment.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, I can't forget that Enlightenment was also the time
Yep.
where the transatlantic slave trade was
Right.
happening.
Right.
So that the idea of the human has, I think Sun Ra got it, that the idea of the human had to be reinvented, remade.
Reconstituted,
That's
which is the
right.
word that I keep thinking about. Was that Shelley poem, "Look ye on my mighty works"? I mean, we're at that point where clearly the ruins are there, and we have to hopefully not only look on them, but reconstitute them. And for me, the possibilities of language, which I feel as though I've been thinking a lot about how, as a someone who is earns a living teaching, I want my students to not merely use language, but see into language, so that they're not skirting and using language to slide over other people. If you, I mean,
Yes.
like to make a claim on the whole matrix of ideologies that dehumanize. And yes, I mean, there's the language that we use, of course, that gets us from point A to point B. How you doing? Checking in with each other. But I'm hoping that after some years now, realizing that it's not just teaching line breaks and metaphors, that it really is about a verticality of hearing, listening, and contributing, however we move up and down that axis or up and down our spines. I mean, we're sitting right now. Do you feel your spine? And can language help you realize that?
I mean, there's something in that. I think, you talk about language as a tool, right, that we use, but language also uses us and shapes us. And so, what are the ways that we recognize that language is telling us what to think, and that the poet steps in and goes, "Oh, no, house? What do you mean? Particular kind of house are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Which is part of what, when I think of Sun Ra, that's what I think he's doing.
He's so disrupted.
Yes.
Disrupted how we hear. I mean, he definitely had his early period, and you can hear it in a poem where he's playing as part of Fletcher Henderson's big band. But then something happens, and his band, they were not wearing, if you Google him, you'll see all the great kind of costumes. This is just as the idea of space is entering into our popular imagination, and he's creating a soundscape based on how he hears the world. And I wonder about how those sounds reconfigured him. You know what I mean? And you and I were talking about how the poems that we write in a way is reinventing us. Every poem, I feel like I'm emerging as some other self that I did not realize that, and against, I want to say all that, against that, oh, I don't want to say Matrix because you're going to think the movie, but the ideologies that have you see me as one type of individual. So much of my writing is about resisting that.
Absolutely. I mean, can we hear more poetry? And I think from Leaving Saturn, a couple more poems,
Okay.
and then to the next one. But I do want us to get to the idea of more about don't know, we talked about love as work, and even liking people is sometimes work. So how do you, and if we think of poetry as work, just getting to that as well, how have you built a practice over decades? Oh,
Two.
it's decades.
2002, 2022.
Yeah, but the story of your becoming a poet, because there's so much sort of beauty and difficulty in that narrative, and that's also impacted how and what you write. Even in Leaving Saturn, you've got Ovid behind you and, and Sun Ra in the poem. And so there's this kind of mix up that's happening that's about how you filter, not even filter, I don't know, how you create a world, a point of reference that does not exist outside the poem, does not exist outside that moment that you make it, I think.
Oh. This is the crux of our long friendship, is that you say something like that and I have to kind of sit with it. And the question of love and poetry is one in which I know, well, first of all, we all have origin stories, and my origin story maybe sounds like someone else. You have people who are charged with your care, and they make decisions that are harmful, indirectly or directly. At some point, you walk away from that foundation hobbled, crippled, insecure, wanting to believe in yourself, but the circumstances have weakened you in that. And so your life becomes this compensatory work of rebuilding yourself. I did not do that alone. I had mentors, I had teachers, I had the art itself. Every poem that I wrote gave me confidence to kind of hear myself, trust what I was hearing, question what I was hearing, question what other people were putting out in the world. And frankly, we call it a canon. For me, these books in this room, I'm looking about 3 or 4 that I'm probably walk out with tonight. Quincy Troop's Duende is right there. I'm going to buy that. I don't have Duende. I know.
I should get that for
I know.
you.
Where I found love was in the voices in which I heard in these pages. And you and I were talking about what prevents writers from growing, that institutionalized pedagogical approach to mimicking writers, when in fact at some point your growth involves listening for yourself in that. So at some point I heard myself. I broke away from the mentorship of the other voices that I was hearing. I also have to say this, Tonya. Lately, I've been thinking about the sadness of the young major who was so dogged and desperate to be heard, and the conditions that pushed me out into the world to become a poet. It wasn't about ego. It was a definite kind of faith in the idea of voice, and the voice among other voices who had opened up this conversation within me.
Mm.
particularly the substance of who we are and who each other are. And so I did not go to those poems just for models. I went to those
For sustenance.
for sustenance. Yeah.
Can you, it's beautiful. And I think, how did you get from accounting classes to poetry classes?
I went to a Kwanzaa event at Temple University. I'm looking at her book right there. Sonia Sanchez read at this event. I was there not because of Kwanzaa, but because of, I mean, yes, partially Kwanzaa, but this fraternity that I was going to pledge put on this Kwanzaa event. And Sonia Sanchez read as part of this program. And the next day I looked to see what courses she was teaching that following semester. And I was part of the Black Student Union. I was president of NAACP on campus. I thought maybe I might be an accountant lawyer, tax lawyer specifically. And
respectable.
yes, very much so. But I was also, I had this this love of literature. All of my classes that weren't in the business school was in the English department at Temple University. And I took about 3 or 4 classes with her.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew by my last semester, my last year, which is when I interned, can't say it was a work study actually, at the Painted Bride Art Center, where I met other poets and artists, musicians, dancers, folks who had already made a decision to be an artist, had found my community. And I have so many stories of the relationships that were born out of that moment.
So art doesn't happen without community.
I belong to multiple communities.
Right.
I cannot see my life without the vision of Cave Canem. Before that, the Darkroom Collective. Before that,
Do you guys know about the Darkroom Collective? Yes, no.
some people are nodding.
Want to tell?
You want to tell? You want to start?
To tell. I wasn't in the Darkroom Collective.
Well, Tisa Bryant no, Tisa is no longer.
Well, no,
Tisa's
Tisa's
at
at Iowa.
She's at Iowa. Okay. Well, in short, the Darkroom Collective is a group of Boston, Cambridge students who started a reading series in Cambridge that would become a group of aspiring writers.
Kevin Young.
Whose members include Kevin Young, Natasha Trethway, Tracy K. Smith, Sharon Strange, Tisa Bryant, John Keene, Archer Stephanie, White. I can go on and on and on. Anyway, the history is out there. I encourage you to read up on it, but I would not be here today without that particular group, along with others along the way. Yeah, I might even be addicted. Can you and I start a collective?
Start a collective, yeah.
In a way, we kind of.
Well, no, actually,
Yeah.
we seriously can, but
Yeah.
we'll talk about that
Yeah.
after.
Yeah.
Will you read some more?
Yes, I will. And you want to read out of Leaving Saturn.
Saturn first, and then we'll go.
Okay.
both to book.
Okay. Is there a particular poem in Leaving Saturn?
I'm thinking about you and your boys.
Okay. I'll fly away. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. I'm best when I'm running full-throated towards the white caps in Truro, piping my woeful tune swell upon swell, keeping company with the red-winged blackbird who my ancient friend Jerry once said governed these parts. With his running mate, the dusty miller, one ruled by land, the other by sea. One painted the air with swoops and trills and praised shafts of light. The other buried himself in sand, imitating tyrants, cursing the vast tongue of the ocean. This was years before Henry James and the Mayflower, and the founding of the ballad, and years before William Bradford established his alehouse on Main in Provincetown. Today, I run the shoreline with my neighbor's collie, blessing his dumb search for wet bark with a little jaunt of my own. Exchanging dirges of our common dream of flight, my arms thrown back to lift my cape-like towel, thinking what would it have been like if there had been no footprints to study the way back to my beloved grief. If children had not waved my journey through seaweed and spindrift, if I would have lived all day watching the schooners and barges edge toward Brooklyn, sipping my sweet glass of tea, dozing off from time to time, breaker phone lapping at my tired black feet. There was never a sound beside the sea except one, and that was my long sigh, the horseshoe crab heard as a whisper. And there was never a shadow sprawled above Truro, large as the one I cast the retired governor saw as a crow. Little Orville and little Wilbur Wright must have jogged along a beach like this one, enraged to find no fresh sand to spike their imprints and no sea air free of brine or herring calls or mollusks or jellyfish, and fallen down beside them, grieving as I have on occasion, waiting for water to come in quietly.
You know, it's something.
Such a goofy poem. I mean, I start writing and I just like go.
So tell me, why do you think this is goofy? Is it
Well,
the sound that you're
It's the joy,
naming
it's the
goofy?
ecstatic, it's the like, it's the,
And it's also grief,
and it is grief. That's right.
right?
It's the reaction to grief.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it is that misery and majesty thing are so bound up in the work.
Thank you for
And-
not letting me get away with it.
Well, I know you,
Yeah.
or I'm knowing you through hearing these poems, but also through our conversation. And I think, like one of the things I think about that, I wonder if the ecstasy becomes a way of avoiding the grief, of avoiding the dirge, and that, yeah.
I need my joy, man. I need my ecstasy. I just have to like exist in that play, in that space of whimsy. You're absolutely right. The grief is definitely there, and I'm signifying on a lot of American touchstones in that poem, Cape Cod. The
Which then gets
mythology.
us to Gwendolyn
with-
Brooks.
That's
and-
right.
Right.
That's right. You know, it is a poem that wants to, in a way, push back against that and assert my own self, my Black body, in that space where we're not used to thinking, we're not used to seeing, and so.
And maybe not used to being.
Well, it's interesting. So obviously, I wrote this when I was in residence at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. I hung out at this bar called the Governor Bradford, where you just thought everyone in there in winter was in the witness protection program, you know. And what's your name? Joe? Peter. My name is Peter. Yeah. But Yusef also had was a fellow there in early 80s, I want to say, and wrote a similar poem about, I didn't realize this until later, the reaction of his Black body on a beach in Cape Cod. And I think, to some extent, you want to laugh when you want to cry, right? So the poem wants to take that moment of scrutiny and children pointing and flip
And
it.
fling your arms out.
That's right.
Yeah. That's why Richard Pryor is my hero. I don't know anybody in more pain.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Wow. Something we were talking about love, and I know I've misquoted this. So Major is also the poet who hosts the Slowdown podcast. And so in the last the February 8th podcast, he talks about love and how being hurt by love, you are you put on your chainmail to sort of protect yourself. And so I was thinking about that, and I think of something a really good friend said to me about her partner of 40 years. And she said, the thing about it for me with Greg is that the good things are twice as good, the bad things are half as bad. And so I began thinking about the possibility of a kind of grief or trauma dispersal unit, right? The idea that we can somehow help each other carry the grief so that it doesn't become, the weapon we turn against those or against others, or the chainmail we put on to sort of protect ourselves from being touched by others. But how do we grieve in public spaces? How do we grieve together so that we don't get cut off from each other?
In it wasn't the Moth Hour, but a nonprofit that I belong to, no surprisingly, in Nashville, the Porch has a heartbreak happy hour. Where
I kind of love this.
Oh, let me tell you, man, your heart by the end of the night, you're holding your partner a little bit tighter. The hank of sentimentalia in the room, it is thick, absolutely thick. And it reminds you of those moments. I was of the generation where you talked to someone on the phone, you fell asleep with that cord, talking to them, like you confessed, you shared things that you never even share with your own family with this person. And then for them to kind of toss that, right? Like,
no, that's a killing crime.
That's right.
That's grits in the face.
My father today, sorry, Dad, called me and we were talking, and he said about early on in he's been married a long time to his wife. And he said early on, she approached me. He was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. She looked him in the face and said, "I will kill you."
And she meant it.
And he had this look of, and she meant it, and he had this look of horror. And he's been in check ever since, because he's afraid that, heartbreak is it will tear us asunder to our soul. I've seen many people give up on love. They put themselves in parole and they never leave a parole of the heart. To experience that, or to love in public or proclaim in public. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I think if anything, I'm thinking about the work of poetry, not only to create that connection of I've been there too. I felt that desolation. I felt that desperation, that desolation. And the hope is, because we know that there are crimes of passion that happened. The hope is that someone sees themselves on the other side as worthy of love. I think if nothing else, even if it's not a kind of a romantic love, that the love that comes off of poems, I don't know where else we can find it. I can't even say I can hear it in music, or I mean, yes, I hear it in works of art, but the speaking directly to that human experience of love. And let me just say, we're talking about a particular kind of love, but you and I both know part of why we are here today talking about post-humanism is because of that lack of inability to love someone other than who you've been conditioned to love. Right. I won't mention this individual. It's still perplexing to me when someone identified a phenotype and said, I can never love someone that looks like that. I mean, the death inside that, something inside them is torn off. What disallows us from seeing beyond?
Well, I wonder about poetry as the place in which and not just poetry, but art as a means of becoming, right? A practice of becoming and becoming again and again and again and again. And that even like once the work of art is made, there it is, right? And so then if it's a poem, perhaps it exists for the reader, perhaps it exists for the writer, and it exists for the audience that assembles itself around the work of art, right? And that it's a configuration of people and of being that otherwise will not exist. And that for me is the sort of profound space and capacity of art, that we get to sort of try out ways of being and ways of thinking, and perhaps introduce them in a world that is not always kind. And that, I mean, that's a mild statement to say the world is not always kind.
I want to pause there for a second, because I want to hold on to what you're saying about the possibility of a poem to kind of create a community who are bonded, not just because of that poem, but quite possibly because of some of what that poem or poems or work is amplifying in the world. And for me, as a writer, it's a level of growth in one's art when you realize you're doing more than just expressing the self, playing with language. You're doing more than just mimicking a form. You are giving, and I don't know why we don't talk about this more. You are giving a spiritual valence, and I don't want people to get caught up on spiritual, but I'm going to say it, something that goes beyond the transactional space of here's a poem that's going to entertain me. And yeah, how much is this? But it's doing something in the world. And maybe that's, I keep coming back to, we have to say, you have to say at every conversation, you have to say art and poetry does nothing. But it survives. And it's that survival, he says, in the valley. Auden says it survives in the valley. It survives for me as possibility of you, and you and I have exchanged poems. We've in the past. Even that gesture, I got a chapbook from a friend up in Portland. That gift of him on the page, he may, God forbid, leave tomorrow, but I treasure that, and I treasure it more than I treasure teaching. And I told you the story. I told her the story today. I'll share it with you. How you can go online, you can see me. I'm talking to my teacher, Sonia Sanchez, after many years of knowing her. The Pew Foundation asked us to come together and have a conversation. And it's in a small room, smaller than this. There's lights everywhere. People are behind cameras. The organizers are there with their boards. And I went to the place, you know, I'm always deferential around elders. Sometimes I wish we cultivated a little bit more in our society. So I'm in the space of being the teacher, being the student with my teacher. And I asked her as a final question, Sonia, what did you want us to take away in those classes? And she said, you know, I knew you were on the path to write poems. I knew that. You were going to learn the craft. But then she put her hand on my knee and said, I wanted you to know I loved you. Teachers, please say that to you. Students,
You may get sued.
you may get sued.
Just
Don't put your hand on the knee. Don't put your hand on their knee. You know what I'm saying.
I know what you're saying, and I'm just
gesture
kidding.
That
That's
yeah.
profound,
Poetry.
right?
What these children need to hear
Is that they are loved.
that they're loved.
And what that means, that it's not like, oh, I like you all the time, or I want to see you most of the time, but that love is work. I will show up for you. I will, you know, take the time. I will do the labor. And that seems to me what, Sister Sonia is all about.
Yeah. And that generation, I think, who kind of weathered
all the deaths, the assassinations, the grief, that's right. There's been, we talked a little bit about this, and Lynn Hygenian died on Saturday. And if you don't know her work, look her work up. She's was a magnificent poet. She taught at Berkeley for a long time. She retired not long ago. Tyrone Williams, another fantastic poet. He's on the East Coast, although now he's in Cincinnati. He was running the SUNY Buffalo program. He's in hospice. And I mention these two names because they're fresh, they're on my mind. But, I've also been thinking about, I've been thinking about Bob Kaufman and his vow of silence for 12 years, right?
During the Vietnam War.
Yes. And this is after, and Kaufman had been in the Coast Guard. He's from my hometown, from New Orleans. He lived in the Bay Area, North Beach. He spent much of his time. His work is here. And in New York, before he moved here, he was beaten up by the police. And I remember David Henderson talking about how he was changed by the violence of that. And yet he was still writing in the margins, right? And he would show up at readings and kind of give these readings. And so I was thinking about his silence, right? That sense that words fail to hold the grief, to hold the mourning. And so what do you do? What do you do with your body? Right? So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, given a lot of what's going on. And before we get back to you reading, I'd actually like to read a poem from Fadi Judah. And it's from a book of his that is coming out in 5 days, I guess, from Milkweed. And the poem is it's untitled. There's an ellipsis, and which is the title of the book. And he writes, "I am unfinished business, the business that did not finish me. Or my parents won't leave my children in peace. In my right hand, a paper. In my left, a feather, to toss, to quill, to meet my terminal velocity. I forget Palestine has a kind way of remembering those who mark it for slaughter and those it marks for life. I write for the future because my present is demolished. I fly to the future to retrieve my demolished present as a legible past, to see what isn't hard to see in a world that doesn't." So I was thinking about Fadi, how the poem holds it, and I can't say the space of the entirety of the grief, right? It's just a moment to recognize what cannot otherwise be said and what teeters on the edge of legibility to us, right? The poem itself is an experience that perhaps helps us bear what is essentially unbearable. Or that's what I'm thinking today.
No, it puts it's, well, first of all, it's just hard not to feel that grief at this moment when so many lives are being lost. And something about war is the language of violence, which is, there's no negotiating with that violence. And it makes a claim. I was talking about earlier, all the ideologies, all the precepts, all the theories, really boils down to how much do you value life? And the poem wants to, in its voicing, assert, in my mind, assert itself in the loudness of that, which is why I value what you just read. Yeah.
You read more poems. Roll deep. I know. It's funny. There's also, and I actually, there's so many things. I could sit here and talk with you forever.
We
And
have. I remember 3-hour lunches, 4-hour lunches on 2nd Avenue near St. Mark's. Remember that? Yeah.
And I think the thing about, I mean, I'm harping on grief, not to harp on grief, and not to make poetry more important than it is, but to harp on being and how perhaps we might help each other carry the griefs we carry and not allow it to harden in us and harden us. So yeah, that we hurt each other. I mean, I feel like a hippy dippy believer in art and in love as the labor we do to assert life anyhow.
Yeah. Well, it's the art in my mind, Tonya. I think the art kind of disrupts business as usual.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the, I value that because one doesn't want to arrive at this particular moment and have all of what we trust as the foundation of our existence suddenly cast in the wake of this into pieces. I think it does do that. In a way, the art has always been there to kind of, in my mind, hint at that that urgency, the limitations. Hopefully, what we were talking about before, the reconstitution of a selfhood, the building of community, all of that is very practical things that are happening right now. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Like it's practical language in areas of conflict on the globe right now. It's one hopes though that there is singing
And dancing.
and
Are
dancing.
you
Yeah.
kidding? That Instagram thing that you sent me.
Oh,
So I'm from New Orleans and I used to dance. I love to dance. I'm old now, so I don't dance as much. But I would go dancing and I'd have so much energy that people would ask my friends, is she on something? And it's like, no, I just love the music. But the video or what do you call the Instagram things? Are they
the rails. Yeah.
reels? So see, the real major scent was someone doing a second line.
Oof.
And she was so focused, and all these people kept trying to dance with her, but she was in her own world. And then her face just lights
At the end.
at the end. Yeah.
And I wrote her, that's me. After just talking to you, I was just like, kind of all serious, but then at the end. And that it's interesting that it popped up right after I hung up with you. And I was like, oh, I gotta send her this, knowing our New Orleans connection. But the necessity of singing, there's languages. So one of my students was telling me about the language of the ER, and there's an acronym for it, and straight from the military. And it's a language that requires you to remove any emotion. It's a language that requires you to just be efficient. And the efficient language is mocked, of course, in works of art. I mean, I hear Auden's poem. I'm quoting Auden a little too much. Let me find someone else.
It goes hard, so.
The citizen poem, but that officious language that is meant to remove feeling, right? I mean, the language of singing brings it back full force 3 times, 4 times, 5 times.
That's right.
Over.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's why when Douglas writes about singing, the slaves are singing, and he's like, if you don't know, these people think these people are happy. It's the most painful songs I've ever heard. And yet somehow the song signals that one is still alive. Still alive.
Yeah.
And that the dance, like the second line is a miracle. I mean, you think of the dirge to the grave, and then the dance
Right.
from the grave. It's like, it ain't me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although, nobody would
Yeah.
ever say that. But there's that celebration.
They're thinking it though. Right? Well, goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about the music that we are brought to make doesn't always come from some benign place. And the emotional cost of putting together a new and selected is revisiting one's early works and the conditions that and the incidents that brought you to the page. And so that meant, okay, I set aside money for a therapist. I had to contend. And that's what I mean is that there was something. Here's an Auden again. Mad Ireland. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. And it's that hurting. And I'm so sad to think of that little major that was brought to poetry because of that. And one of the poems in the new section called Double Major, I guess. No, that's Urban Renewal. He believes his poetry will heal his wounds. And that is true. I needed poetry to grant me some sort of purpose. I needed to grant me dignity. I needed it to say that I'm a thinking, intelligent being despite a world that only sees this body. You know what I mean? Like, it's painful for me to think about that journey. I'm happy where it is. I'm happy about the map that it creates.
You also fought for this. I mean,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I'm not to think about that is not to it's not to discount this particular moment. In fact, I'm very proud. What I've seen, I could only put it in language and put it in words because I needed those words. I needed to be kind of revise myself what I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Will you read that poem?
Yeah, I'll read it. Yeah, I'll read it. Actually, I said it was in the new section. It's in actually it's in Absurd Man. And it's called Double Major. Now that I think about it, it's the last poem in the book. Double Major. I emerge. The conceit of this poem is Major is talking about Major. And it's a pun on academia. Double Major, but you knew that, didn't you? I didn't need to say that last part. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings and ordered athenaeums. I own his face, but he spends little, he spends, I know this poem. I own his face, but he watches and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They stare his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know, his dreams are his father's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possessed a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls our thirst for pads and pencils destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, he closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability, the test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed. To bed.
Yes, audience. I'm sorry. Here's the thing. Sorry to ignore you. Do you have questions for Major?
I'm so excited to be here with you, Major, and Tonya, because you've both been my teachers. But my question is really about, one, this is a fascinating conversation. I would love to go to dinner with the two of you. I would not be able to say a word and you would just go on just like this for hours, but I'd at least have something to eat and that would be fantastic. What I want to know about is when you're doing a new and selected, I really am interested in that. I'm really interested in that, in how you, because it's sort of like creating and looking back at yourself and your own body of work and just what went into that process. And that's something that I aspire to one day, perhaps, and which the editor of my first chapbook helped me let go of my poems so that the new book can be its own thing and not have to just copy it over. And it's like, okay, I will keep doing so that I can have a new and selected and pick the one. So I'd love to know about that process.
I several strategies actually. And one was to take the poems out of the books themselves, because there was something almost, they were little monuments to my little, my obsession. So I needed to have a different relationship to my body of work. So I typed them up and I would put them into little chapbooks based on sections in the book, and I would toss them around the house. And this gave me the privilege of encountering them, not in their kind of covers, but, if I'm waiting for water to boil for pasta, I pick it up, and that gave me the editing eye that I needed, because if it did not click in that particular moment, 21st century, 2022, 21, yeah, those years. That's right. It was during those years when we were all experiencing the global health crisis. So interestingly enough, what that also allowed me to do was get a sense of kind of dominant themes and the curatorial act of how am I going to create poems that echo newer poems that kind of pick up and maybe even coalesce around certain themes. So a lot of the poems were, maybe half the poems in the first section, the new part, were already written, and then other poems were kind of written to kind of extend beyond. Then there was the question of order. And most people kind of start with their latest work because they're most proud of that. And then they move back. And then they'll end with the new. I decided to do the new and then go with first book and work forward to the last book. So the last book of the poem, which is The Absurd Man, is in there. The other thing I did was I asked 3 readers, and I actually paid them. One of them is a dear friend. Another I met at Napa, former student at Napa, and it might have been community writers. I cannot keep those. I know, no. I love them both. I love both those communities. I'm sure it was Napa, actually. And another was a former student, a dear friend, and someone who I'd only spent a week with, all of whom I have kind of admired their work. And they gave me feedback that one of them was, hey, I know your work for a long time. I'm missing this poem. It's not in there. You cut it out. That was really helpful. There was a poem in there that I used to read for a while, actually, that's not in here. And although I did not ask this person to kind of be a sensitivity reader, they did say, hey, do you want this out in the world? And my first reaction is, I believe in art, first and foremost. Let's see how far that gets you. I believe in art, but I also did not want to harm anyone. So I lived with that decision for a long time and decided not to put it in there. It was snarky. It was called OK Cupid. It was born out of my days of dating online, which I hated.
Okay, that was not an ad for OK
No, it was
Cupid.
not. It was not. I bet, anyway. So in the end, I thought, it was topical. And I wanted to go for a substance. So yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, I have a question. I love that you started with the new.
Mhm.
And you began that description by explaining that people generally start with the work they're most proud of. So is the new work the work you're most proud of?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I
fantastic.
wouldn't say most proud. Like that wasn't the criteria. For me, it was who I am today. There's some embarrassments in those early poems, and I'm comfortable with that. And those are in there too. But I want someone who encounters my work to not be turned off by the earlier major, whose myopia, aesthetic and otherwise, was full force. I cannot, when I teach, I am so driven by knowing that, I don't want to call them young people, but these individuals are going to grow. Things are going to happen to them, and the art is going to be consistently there. And it's going to be, in some instances, going to be a savior for them. So with Razzle Dazzle, you want me to sing, don't you? That old Broadway song. No, I won't do it. Your ears will thank you. But with Razzle Dazzle, it was about here I am today, and here's how I evolved. Like it wasn't, I'm most proud of these particular poems, but I wanted an individual to say, all right, this is him. These are his concerns. This is his how he approaches language, how he approaches metaphor. These are the topics that are important to him. There are activist poems in the early section. There are poems that are all about just poetry and the role of poetry. There's poems that pay homage to family. Yeah, it's a portraiture in that first section. And hopefully there's something in there that, I don't know, that maybe even the reader wants to kind of say, okay, let me follow this strand. I feel inadequate. That was an inadequate answer.
That was not an inadequate answer. That was the answer you gave. Right? What's the it's funny how you sat back and did this like view of your answer. And so I'm thinking about, we talked earlier about the maestro.
Yeah.
Thing you care to say?
Well, we were talking about how I'm not seeking that kind of reputation as a writer. I'm happy to have those writers to study if that's the case. Poetry is far more elemental to me than performing mastery. It goes back to not just the sustenance, but really something that I've used as a way to kind of reveal to myself the nature of my heart, my intellect, my beingness, others. Particularly in teaching, I'm trying to create some other space in our lives for art other than something that we learn and have a certain kind of virtuosity. I had this great debate with one of my former colleagues at University of Vermont, Huck Gutman, and we were talking about Rilke, and we were talking about the Ninth Elegy. And I said something along the lines of the role of revision. And Huck truly believes that you get to a space in your work where the utterance is so pure as that elegy is, that it's not a condition of composing the perfect poem. It's a condition of saying the thing that needs to be said for us at that moment.
I'm sorry.
No. You know, so
It
I think
cannot
that's the
be
distinction.
edited. You can't edit out the wildness, the unruliness, the discomfort, whatever, the messiness. I'm sorry, I get very excited about that. 'Cause
And it is an essential component to making. Yeah. Yeah. Yeva had a question. Did anyone else have? Rachel?
So much of this conversation has been about communities of writers that you've learned from and sort of see your lineage as coming from, and about that you've been involved with too. And I mean, the Dark Room Collective and your friendship with Tonya, and the fact that you're friends with like half the people in this room. I think of you as like such a literary citizen, and even the work that you do at the Slowdown now. I mean, all of these kinds of ways of having a conversation through poetry and putting poetry out in the world. And I was just curious about how it enters your process. I know you have a writing group that you thank in this book, which it's really an interesting group of people too, because they're multi-generational. And I'm wondering about how community affects the writing process for you.
Early on, I truly have an addiction to how the poem mediates our connection. Like you and I have a connection that goes back to your own work. And would we be together were it not? Would we be in this room together? That's the power and the faith that I first, when you ask that question, I first go there. next, I'm like anyone else. I'm attached to that first draft. You know, I need to hear someone, relieve me of my pomposity and say, almost, but not there. But the groups, the exchange, actually, right now it's more accountability and generative. And for me, someone who has taken on quite a bit of administrative work at my job, it also is great in making sure that I don't give over to the seduction of power in academia, which is not really power, if you know what I mean. Like, that's no offense to administrators in the room, but to some extent, my true self is the self that is contemplating recently all of those emperors who right now you're gonna hear a Slowdown podcast on this one. All the emperors who would name meteors after themselves. Like that was somehow, evidence of their power. That's the latest poem I'm writing. Not budgets. I do that work too, and well, but yeah. Oh yeah, sure. You might have to repeat that question.
I said, who's the best at relieving you of your pomposity in the first draft?
D.D. Jackson. Yeah. I a two-poet household, as you know, has a lot of benefits, but also a lot of challenges. Yeah.
Do we have another question?
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
You want to come up, or you want the mic protest?
Thanks so much for the time. So much of what you said tonight is about, using language to share those truths. And, yours, a lot of the people's in here, your understanding of language is going to be pretty dramatically different than most. And so when you're writing that kind of creation, how do you make sure you're able to bridge that gap, and what people will hear and take is what you're trying to put down? Now, that's a broad question, but any.
No, thank you for it. Thank you for all these questions. To some extent, I do believe in bridges, and I look for those bridges in the world. Often, at least early on, illusion was huge in my work, and you kind of still hear in that last poem, you probably heard a little Keats, at least in some of the cadences I know who I'm riffing off of. There's a line in one of the poems that is a pure ripoff of Robert Frost, which is okay. You can steal from him.
Auden too.
On too. So I do believe in bridges, and I do think there's a function, and I don't think, like some of my students at a certain moment had this belief that if you drop a Greek mythological figure, you are performing your intellect, and I don't believe that. I think they have to have a more capacious understanding of how hard it is, how difficult it is to make that connection, such that language has an impact. I mean, I've read poems by poets who were born in the early 1800s that had me weep. Somehow they crossed that bridge. I read poems well, people very different from me phenotypically, not even just age, that hit at something that I needed to hear that very day, that very moment. And so maybe because I've experienced it myself, I trust that I am not, and let me just say, this requires a restlessness. It requires not giving in to the familiar tropes. Some people use tropes, not realizing the extent to which they've been worn. And so the experimentations that we get in the world also kind of seep in and do a necessary work of reviving language so that we can hear it and taste it and dance with it a little differently. But that different, your question about different conceptions of language is really important in an age, in a year of elections, because it's going to be, they're going to pull it all out again. They're going to, the language is going to be there to construct pockets of voters, and it's going to be there to construct walls of fear. And the wonderful thing about this room is that I can almost assure you that anyone who practices this art is attuned, and they can feel the violence that emerges out of our screens, that emerges out of televisions, newscasts. It all is circumspect, because on a daily, maybe weekly, I don't know how often you write, we are inside language. And that's what I meant earlier about, I keep saying that because I feel like I'm not adequately making the point, but to go inside language, to hear its properties. I think you said house earlier. Someone mentioned mother, smother. To hear that all the uses that those words, moon, the sound of it in the mouth. Some ancestor used that word, or combinations of word. I wish I was bilingual or trilingual, because that would give me the necessary lens I need to kind of police something that I know is coming at me to harm me. And so the poetry revives in me this kind of guardedness, but also I'm relishing in it. Like I hear language as sounds, I see it as colors. And my hope is writing these poems, these lines, go to something we know. The Russian notion of defamiliarizing. My hope is, and trust, that somehow is going to reach beneath is going to go cellular.
I mean, it's something. Also, the thing about language is that each word carries a history. So somehow to turn the word over, to dive into its etymology, is also about almost breaking it open on the level of the syllable.
You're not enjoying that.
Then
You know what I mean?
do something else.
You know, if you're not inside and understanding what Derek Walcott will often talk about as kind of the echoes, and the echoes of a word and its various shades and meanings, and how it can be a textured thing, how it can be used as a source of rhythm that's doing its own signifying and its own figuring. I don't want to call up the familiar tropes, but you know what I'm talking about, people.
Some people don't.
Some people don't. That's very true.
But it's funny you mentioned Walcott, and I go to Brathwaite.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
And that Brathwaite's
Yes.
call for nation language, that in fact is the language that recognizes the rhythm of the hurricane, better
That's
than it
right.
does the
Yeah.
falling of the snow.
Yeah.
So that it's not only that one is attuned to the etymology, but you're attuned to the histories that surround the movement of the language too. And so it may affect your accent, it may affect all those other linkages you make, which is
Which, if the other thing is like, if it's an active practice of entering into the stream
yeah.
of existence right now, like you're hearing the language that's spoken around you in your community, you're in that idiom, you're in that vernacular, you're just bound to kind of cultivate a practice of writing poems that is driven by the ear and driven by community.
By paying
By
deep
paying
attention.
deep
What's your oh, people are leaving. Is it time? We've been
going. We've been going. We've been
It's
going.
another poem, and then
One more
we
poem. Yeah.
call it.
Yeah. You guys just experienced Major and Tonya's lunches. This is our lunch in New York. Okay. This is called Let Me Begin Again. This is the first poem. If I read the last one, I should read the first poem for symmetry and balance. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell, slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, snifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the islands of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the bird cage or the serrated blade or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips.
Major, thank you so much for your time. Steve and Peter, thank you for making a space for us. And all of you who came out tonight, it's beautiful. Some of you I know, actually. So it's lovely to see you. And
thank Tonya Foster.
Be well. Be well and be kind. Love is work. And books over there.
Oh, yeah, I want to hear him talking more about that. I'm not excited.